The heavy drag of velvet over the cold marble floors of the southern palace was a sound I had long learned to fear. It was the sound of Queen Regent Felicity, my stepmother, approaching. But on that particular afternoon, the corridors were suffocatingly silent. The grand arched windows of the royal western wing let in the dying amber light of an autumn sun, casting long skeletal shadows across the gilded walls. I stood in the hidden alcove just outside the king's private council chambers, my spine pressed flat against the intricately carved stone, forcing myself to breathe softly. The heavy oak doors were not fully closed. A sliver of golden candlelight spilled onto the polished floor, carrying with it the voices that would permanently sever the thread of my life. "Send the plain one to the northern borders," Felicity decreed. Her voice did not echo with cruelty. It was far worse. It held the bored absolute certainty of a monarch sorting through matters of taxation or the disposal of old armory. "She will only embarrass the crown during the upcoming royal season. Put her in Heir of Keep. It is desolate enough that no one in the court will ask questions, and isolated enough that it will cost our treasury nothing we shall miss." My father, the king in name but a ghost in presence, said nothing. The silence that followed her decree was the same deafening silence he had offered for the past 6 years whenever my name was spoken. I was 24, a princess of the realm by blood, yet I stood in the shadows of my own ancestral home, with my hands trembling against the velvet of my outdated gown. I had survived worse indignities than this. I had survived the quiet, systematic erasure of my existence. But something about the way she used the word plain, discarding a daughter of the crown, like a piece of tarnished silver, struck a hollow place in my chest that I thought I had armored with ice years ago. What neither Felicity nor my father knew, and what I would not discover until the bitter winds of the north had already chapped my skin, was that we were not the only ones listening. The Winter King Thomas of the Northern Domain had been in the Southern Palace for exactly 3 days. He had come to negotiate the territorial borders with my father's council. He was a ruler known for his iron will and frozen heart, a man who spoke little and observed everything. At that exact moment, hidden in the adjoining drawing room, waiting for his audience, he overheard the very same conversation from the other side of that grand oak door. I did not know that yet. I wouldn't learn it for weeks. But by the time I did, every lie I had been fed about my own worth would have already begun to crumble like ancient stone. They placed me in an unmarked carriage hours before the palace awoke. The dawn was a violent, bruised purple across the horizon. My half-sister Princess Lucille was still asleep in the eastern wing, her golden hair fanned across pillows of imported Athelian silk purchased with the wealth of my late mother's royal dowry, though to utter such a truth in the palace was considered treason. Queen Regent Felicity had married my father 6 years after the tragic passing of my mother, the true Queen Catherine. From the moment the coronation crown touched Felicity's dark hair, she had spent every waking hour eradicating the evidence that Catherine had ever breathed the air of this court. The towering portrait of my mother above the throne room mantel was replaced with a tapestry of Felicity's own ancestral crest. The grand pianoforte my mother used to play an instrument that once filled the grand halls with soaring sonatas was chopped into firewood. Her sacred rose gardens were paved over with unyielding cobblestone to make a terrace where Felicity could host foreign dignitaries. I was allowed to keep exactly one relic, a simple silver cameo brooch bearing the ancient royal insignia which Felicity deemed too archaic and worthless to confiscate. It rested at my throat now, biting with the cold morning air, as the carriage lurched forward, beginning the grueling journey north. My name is Princess Eleanor, and for the first 20 miles of the punishing, bone-rattling ride, I forced myself to look out the frosted glass and pretend this exile was a mercy. Remaining in the southern palace during the royal season would have meant standing in the shadowed corners of the grand ballrooms, wearing a gown 3 seasons out of fashion, while Lucille was paraded before visiting princes and dukes like a flawless diamond upon a velvet cushion. It would have meant enduring Felicity's sharp, poisoned whispers to the court ladies about my angular face, my excessive time spent reading in the archives, and the unsettling way I refused to smile for men who viewed me as a mere political pawn. It would have meant watching my father stare right through me, as though looking at me was too painful a reminder of a past he lacked the courage to defend. The north, I told myself, as the landscape outside shifted from lush green valleys to jagged, unforgiving mountains, meant solitude. And solitude meant I could finally let my guard down, I could breathe without the suffocating scent of palace intrigue filling my lungs. But I had never laid eyes upon Heir of Keep. I did not know its history, its decaying walls, or its dangerous proximity to the epicenter of northern power. I had been told only two things by the captain of the royal guard before he shut the carriage door. The keep is habitable, Your Highness. A woman from the lower village will bring you basic provisions. Do not send ravens to the capital unless it is a matter of life and death. He did not bow. He did not say, Your Grace. I was already stripped of my phantom crown. The journey north was not merely a physical traverse across the continent. It was a slow, agonizing descent into a frozen purgatory. For 7 unyielding days, the unmarked carriage wheels fought against trade roads that shifted from packed southern dirt to treacherous ice-slicked cobblestone. Inside the carriage, the temperature dropped. With every passing hour, a creeping, insidious chill that seeped through the thin soles of my leather slippers and settled deep into my bones. I had been allowed no royal trunks, no velvet cloaks lined with ermine, and no ladies-in-waiting to warm the heavy woolen blankets over a carriage brazier. I had only the garments on my back and a single volume of ancient history I had smuggled beneath my skirts. With every mile that distanced me from the southern palace, the invisible crown I had worn in secret, the legacy of Queen Catherine, felt heavier pressing down on me until I could barely hold my head upright. By the time the carriage finally turned off the King's Highway, the landscape had transformed into an intimidating canvas of jagged snow-capped peaks and endless sweeping moors of frost. The winds here did not merely blow, they howled a guttural ancient sound that battered against the wooden frame of the carriage like the fists of a besieging army. We halted before a structure that could only be described as a monument to forgotten wars, Heir of Keep. It was not a cottage, nor was it a manor. It was a brutalist spire of black stone thrusting upward from the frozen earth, its battlements crumbling and its iron-wrought gates rusted shut with years of neglect. As the guards shoved the heavy oak doors open, the hinges shrieked a deafening metallic protest that echoed across the empty snow-covered valley. The captain of the guard did not escort me inside. He simply dropped my single meager satchel at the threshold. "The crown wishes you a quiet life, Lady Eleanor," he said, deliberately omitting my royal title for the final time. The snap of the carriage reins cut through the freezing air, and within moments I was utterly alone. I stepped over the threshold, my worn shoes echoing sharply against the damp, uneven flagstones of the entrance hall. The air inside the keep was colder than the wind outside, trapped within feet-thick stone walls that had not seen a hearth fire in a decade. There was a single narrow bed in what used to be a warden's chamber, adorned with a moth-eaten blanket. The grand fireplace, large enough to roast a boar, was choked with decades of ash and fallen masonry. I walked to the lone narrow window, a slit in the thick stone, meant for archers, not for light. As I wiped the thick layer of frost from the glass, my breath hitched in my throat. There, towering over the northern horizon like a god of ice and stone, was the Winter Palace. It was a staggering architectural marvel of white marble obsidian and soaring spires that pierced the gray clouds. A fortress of absolute power. Even from leagues away, I could see the glow of 1,000 fires, illuminating its grand arched windows, reflecting off the glacial lake that surrounded its impregnable walls. It was a kingdom that bowed to no southern ruler. It was the seat of King Thomas. I stood in the freezing shadows of my ruined keep, staring at the blazing glory of his domain. Queen Regent Felicity had believed she was sending me to the edge of the world to rot in obscurity. She did not realize she had placed me directly at the gates of the only monarch powerful enough to rival our own. That first night I did not sleep. I huddled beneath the thin blanket, my teeth chattering violently, the silver cameo brooch of my mother pressed against my sternum as if it could generate warmth. I listened to the wind tear at the loose shingles of the roof. I did not cry. Tears would freeze on my cheeks. Instead, I let the cold sharpen my mind, honing the betrayal of my family into a blade I swore I would one day unsheathe. I did not meet the Winter King on my first day in exile, nor my second. The person I met was a force of nature in her own right. She arrived on the morning of my third day, just as my desperate attempts to coax a spark from damp, rotting timber in the hearth had left my hands blistered and soot-stained. The heavy oak door of the keep swung open without a knock, and there stood a woman of perhaps 60 years. Her iron-gray hair was pinned back with severe military precision beneath a crisp white linen cap. She wore the heavy, immaculate black uniform of a high royal servant, and draped over her arm was a basket woven of thick reeds smelling faintly of freshly baked bread, sharp northern cheese, and spiced preserved plums. She halted in the doorway. Her piercing blue eyes swept over the damp stone walls, the pathetic smoldering twigs in the massive hearth, and finally my shivering form, wrapped in a threadbare shawl that had once belonged to a scullery maid. "You are the exiled princess of the South," she stated. It was not a question. Her voice commanded the room echoing off the stone. I stood up straight, forcing my spine to align with the royal posture I had been beaten into learning since childhood. I hid my blackened, trembling hands behind the folds of my skirt. "I am Eleanor, and you are Mrs. Fenn, head of the royal household for the Winter Palace." She stepped fully into the room, setting the basket down on a warped wooden table with a sharp, resonant thud. Her expression tightened into a mask of pure, restrained outrage. "This is completely unacceptable." "It is what the Southern Crown arranged," I replied, my voice remarkably steady despite the violent shivering of my jaw. "The Southern Crown holds no authority over this land," Mrs. Fenn snapped, her gaze snapping back to mine. "Heir of Keep is a sovereign fortress of the Winter Kingdom. It has been decommissioned for a century. We received no royal missive that it would be occupied, let alone by a royal daughter." I felt the frozen floor tilt slightly beneath my feet. Felicity had lied. She had not secured a legal exile. She had essentially trespassed me onto foreign sovereign soil to ensure my presence would be an insult to the Winter King. It was a calculated move. If the Winter Kingdom discovered a southern princess squatting in their ruined keep, they might execute me for espionage, saving Felicity the trouble of an assassination. "I must inform His Majesty immediately," Mrs. Fenn said, her tone absolute. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded my veins. "Please, Mrs. Fenn, if word reaches your king, he may see my presence as an act of war. I will survive. Just leave the bread." Mrs. Fenn stopped at the doorway. She looked at me with the particular unwavering steadiness of a woman who had managed the greatest palace in the realm and would not suffer fools nor cruelty. "His Majesty King Thomas is not the tyrant your southern gossips claim him to be, Your Highness, and he certainly does not let women freeze to death on his lands." She left before I could formulate a plea. That evening, just as the sun dipped below the icy horizon, a heavy wagon arrived. 6 royal guardsmen, clad in the silver and obsidian armor of the Winter Palace, unloaded cords of premium kiln-dried ironwood. They stacked it silently, expertly beside the great hearth. They left without a single word, but the roaring, magnificent fire that consumed the wood that night was the first true warmth I had felt in 6 years. I saw him on the 5th day. I had climbed the winding, treacherous stone stairs to the upper battlements of the keep, desperate for fresh air that did not smell of damp decay. The wind on the roof was brutal, slicing through my thin garments, but the view of the sweeping crystalline moors was breathtaking. Then I saw the rider. He was positioned on a high ridge overlooking Heir of Keep, a stark, commanding silhouette against the blinding white snow. He rode a massive warhorse as black as a starless night. Even across the vast distance, the sheer authority radiating from the man was palpable. He sat in the saddle with the coiled absolute stillness of a predator, a king who observed his domain before he struck. He was not looking at the keep. He was looking directly at me. The distance between us was too great to discern the color of his eyes or the sharp angles of his jaw, but the weight of his gaze was a physical force. It pinned me to the stone. For years I had trained myself to be invisible, to shrink into the shadows of my father's court. But under the intense, unyielding stare of the Winter King, there was nowhere to hide. He saw me. He saw the exiled princess standing unbroken in the freezing winds. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic echoing rhythm. I did not look away. I lifted my chin, letting the wind whip my dark hair around my face, and held the gaze of the most feared monarch in the realm. The next morning, a wooden crate bearing the royal crest of the Winter Palace appeared inside the heavy oak doors of the keep. Inside, resting on a bed of pristine tissue, was a cloak. It was a masterpiece of tailoring. Heavy spun wool dyed in the deepest, richest shade of royal sapphire blue, lined with impossibly soft dark fur. It was not a peasant's garment. It was the cloak of a queen. Tucked into the folds of the heavy collar was a parchment note sealed with black wax. The handwriting was sharp, elegant, and uncompromisingly masculine. "The northern winds have no mercy for those who refuse to arm themselves against it. T. I should have burned it. To accept such a gift from a foreign king was a political scandal of the highest order. But as I lifted the heavy velvet and draped it over my trembling shoulders, the intoxicating warmth of it enveloped me like an embrace. The part of my soul that had been starved, beaten down, and treated as royal rubbish felt something dangerous and fierce ignite. Someone knew my worth. The Winter King knew I was freezing, and he had chosen to drape me in the colors of royalty. And in that quiet, echoing stone hall wrapped in his protection, the banished princess began to dream of a stolen throne. The royal summons arrived 2 days later. It was not delivered by a mere messenger, but by the commander of the Winter Guard himself, carrying a scroll of heavy vellum sealed with the silver dire wolf crest of the Northern Crown. His Majesty King Thomas requests the presence of Princess Eleanor at the Winter Palace to formally discuss the terms of her sanctuary. The commander recited, his voice echoing off the stone walls of Heir of Keep. It was on the surface a matter of political protocol, a sovereign formally addressing a high-born foreign guest residing on his land. Yet, as I pinned my mother's silver cameo to the collar of the heavy sapphire cloak the king had gifted me, my hands betrayed a slight tremble. I was stepping into the epicenter of northern power utterly alone, armed with nothing but my wits and a forgotten royal title. The carriage that arrived for me was not the unmarked, freezing wooden box my stepmother had banished me in. It was a royal conveyance lined with crushed black velvet and heated by intricate smokeless braziers. As we crossed the drawbridge over the frozen glacial lake, the Winter Palace loomed above me, a breathtaking cathedral of white marble and black iron. Stepping into the grand entrance hall was like stepping into a monument of eternity. The floors were carved from a single seamless expanse of polished obsidian, reflecting the thousands of floating candles that hovered in the vaulted ceilings above. Every step I took echoed through the cavernous space, the heavy rustle of my wool and velvet skirts whispering against the stone like the quiet drawing of a blade. There was no chaotic chatter of courtiers here, no sycophants vying for attention as they did in my father's court. Here there was only order imposing majesty and the heavy reverent silence of absolute discipline. Mrs. Fenn met me at the base of the grand staircase, offering a deep, respectful curtsy that no southern servant had afforded me in 6 years. "This way, Your Highness. The king awaits you in the royal archives." She led me through corridors adorned with tapestries of ancient battles and frost-covered landscapes, finally stopping before a set of towering doors made of pale silvered wood. As the guards pulled them open, I felt my breath catch in my throat. The royal archives of the Winter Palace was a staggering cathedral of knowledge. Spiral staircases of wrought iron wound up through 3 stories of towering bookshelves holding tens of thousands of leather-bound volumes. The scent of ancient parchment, beeswax, and cedar filled the air. "You have found the true heart of my kingdom, princess." His voice came from the shadows to my left, low, resonant, and possessing a rough edge that suggested he rarely used it for pleasantries. I turned. King Thomas stood beside a massive hearth, where a fire roared behind an iron grate. Up close, he was even more imposing than he had been on the ridge. He was a man carved from the very ice of his domain, tall, broad-shouldered, clad in immaculate dark tunics slashed with silver. His dark hair was slightly longer than southern fashion, dictated framing a face of sharp, unforgiving angles. But it was his eyes that struck me into stillness. They were a pale, piercing gray, holding the light like shards of frost. They lacked the bored cruelty of southern lords. Instead, they burned with a terrifying absolute intelligence. I sank into a flawless, court-perfect curtsy. "Your Majesty." "Rise, Eleanor," he commanded softly. The sound of my name spoken without my title, yet with more reverence than I had ever heard, sent a sudden electric shock down my spine. "I must thank you for the cloak, Your Majesty," I said, keeping my chin level as I stood. "And for the wood. You are overly generous to a banished ward." "You are not a ward. You are a daughter of a king standing on my soil," he replied, taking a slow, measured step toward me. "And I do not tolerate the freezing of my guests, regardless of the political games being played in the South. Tell me, why did your family send you to Heir of Keep?" There it was, the strike of the blade. No polite maneuvering, no courtly dances. The Winter King dealt only in truths. I could have offered him the political lie. I could have claimed illness, a desire for religious solitude, or a temporary retreat. But standing beneath the weight of his pale, piercing gaze, I realized that lying to this man would be both an insult and a fatal mistake. "I was in the way," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet ringing clearly in the silent library. He tilted his head, his eyes narrowing slightly. In the way of what? Of my half-sister's royal season, of Queen Regent Felicity's unchecked ambitions, of the flawless, untarnished narrative she has spun since she placed the crown upon her own head. I lifted my chin, forcing myself to hold his stare. I am a relic of the true Queen, Your Majesty, and relics are best kept buried where no one can be reminded of their existence. For a long, agonizing moment, the king said nothing. The only sound was the crackle of the hearth and the distant howl of the northern wind against the thick glass windows. He looked at me, not a fleeting glance, but a deep structural assessment that seemed to strip away my defenses and read the scars on my soul. "They are fools," he finally said, his voice dropping an octave heavy with a dark, dangerous promise. "Your Majesty." He closed the distance between us, stopping just a breath away. The sheer heat radiating from him was intoxicating. To possess a weapon of such sharp intellect and royal bearing, and to bury it in the snow. He looked down at me, his jaw tightening. "They are fools, Eleanor, but their blindness is my kingdom's gain." He did not touch me. He did not need to. The sheer force of his presence, the absolute validation in his words, shattered the fragile ice I had encased my heart in. In the grand echoing library of the Winter Palace, the exiled princess found something far more dangerous than sanctuary. I found an equal. The fragile sanctuary we had begun to build was violently shattered 3 weeks later by the arrival of a southern raven. I knew something was wrong when the daily delivery of firewood to Heir of Keep arrived without the customary basket of fresh pastries from Mrs. Fenn. The northern winter had deepened, burying the valley under drifts of pristine, blinding snow, but the cold inside my chest had nothing to do with the weather. For a week I heard nothing from the Winter Palace. The king who had taken to joining me in the archives to fiercely debate the treatises of ancient conquerors vanished. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the estate. The absence of his sharp intellect and his steady, grounding gaze left me feeling unmoored, terrified that I had somehow overstepped an invisible line of royal protocol. On the 8th day, I could endure the silence no longer. Wrapping the heavy sapphire cloak tightly around my shoulders, I braved the blizzard and walked the 2 miles to the Winter Palace. The royal guards at the obsidian gates did not cross their halberds to block my path. They bowed deeply and pushed the massive iron doors open, a silent confirmation that the king had issued standing orders regarding my presence. I bypassed the entrance hall and marched directly toward his private study in the western wing, my boots leaving damp prints on the polished marble. I did not knock. I pushed the heavy oak doors open. King Thomas was standing behind a massive desk, carved from solid black ironwood. He looked as though he had not slept in days. The sharp angles of his face were drawn taut with a simmering, lethal fury. Scattered across the surface of his desk were dozens of missives, maps, and ledgers, but dead center rested a piece of parchment bearing the undeniable crimson wax seal of the Southern Queen Regent. He looked up as I entered. The raw, violent intensity in his eyes made me freeze in my tracks. "Your stepmother," Thomas said, his voice terrifyingly calm, devoid of all its usual warmth, "is a remarkably thorough architect of destruction." He picked up the parchment. The heavy rustle of the paper sounded like a guillotine blade sliding into place. "Queen Regent Felicity has written to me personally. She states under the seal of the crown that you are a treasonous opportunist of entirely corrupt morals. She claims you were exiled to the north not for your health, but to prevent you from executing a scandalous coup against your father, and that you have a history of seducing lords of the court to fund your rebellion. She explicitly warns me to place you under armed guard, lest you attempt to manipulate the winter crown to further your so-called treason." The room tilted violently on its axis. The blood drained from my face, leaving my skin colder than the snow outside. Felicity was not satisfied with erasing me. She was actively trying to arrange my execution on foreign soil. If a visiting royal was deemed a threat to the Winter King, the penalty was death. "There was no rebellion," I whispered, my voice breaking under the crushing weight of her malice. "There was no scandal. There was no seduction. I swear to you upon my mother's soul, Thomas, I swear it." "I know." The 2 words cracked like thunder through the study. I stared at him, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "How could you know?" Thomas rounded the heavy desk. The lethal fury in his eyes was not directed at me. It was radiating outward, a shield of fire cast to protect me. Because I did not become the ruler of the most unforgiving kingdom on this continent by trusting the words of southern vipers. Before the wax on her letter had even cooled, I dispatched my fastest riders and my most ruthless spies to the southern capital to investigate her claims. He reached out his gloved hand, coming to rest on the edge of the desk, his knuckles white. He was breathing heavily, a man reigning in the urge to wage a war. There is no scandal, Eleanor, but my spies found what she was truly hiding. They breached the royal vaults. Thomas picked up a second older document, its edges frayed, sealed with the silver and sapphire crest of my late mother, Queen Catherine. What I discovered, and what I suspect they have kept from you your entire life, is the truth of your mother's final royal decree. Queen Catherine did not simply leave you a cameo brooch. He stepped closer, the sheer gravity of his presence commanding the space between us. She established a sovereign trust, the vanguard of the silver crown. It is a fortune vast enough to buy armies, accompanied by a legally binding decree that names you and you alone as the absolute heir to the southern throne. Not your father, not Felicity. You. My breath vanished. The walls of the study seemed to close in. That is impossible! My father is king! Your father was a consort who usurped power when your mother died. Thomas corrected his voice, a low, vicious growl of justice. The decree stipulates that upon your 25th birthday, the royal guard, the treasury, and the southern lords are legally bound to kneel to you. You are the rightful reigning queen of the South. Tears, hot and unbidden, spilled over my lashes. The cruelty of it all was staggering. My birthday is in 4 months, Thomas finished for me. They did not send you to the north to hide your plainness, Eleanor. They sent you to the most dangerous, freezing edge of the world, hoping the winter would kill you before you could claim your crown. And when you survived, she sent this letter, hoping I would finish the job for her. A sob tore from my throat. All the years of humiliation, of being treated as a burden, of silencing my own voice, it had all been a calculated, terrified performance by a usurper who knew she was sitting on a stolen throne. I crumpled forward, my hands covering my face, shattered by the magnitude of the betrayal. Thomas did not hesitate. The king who touched no one, the monarch of ice and iron, crossed the final distance between us and pulled me into his arms. He crushed me to his chest, his large hands burying into the heavy velvet of my cloak, his chin resting fiercely against the top of my head. The smell of cedar frost and leather enveloped me. He held me together as I fell apart, absorbing the shock waves of my grief. I will not let this stand, he whispered into my hair, his voice vibrating with a dark, terrifying oath of vengeance. They sent a forgotten princess to die in the snow. They did not know the Winter King would help her forge a new crown. I wept until there was nothing left inside me but a vast echoing hollow. Through it all, the Winter King did not release me. He stood as immovable as the glacial mountains of his realm, offering a silent, unyielding fortress against the devastation that was tearing my world apart. When my tears finally ceased, leaving my chest heaving and my throat raw, I pulled back slowly. Thomas did not let me retreat far. His large hands moved to my shoulders, his grip firm and grounding. He reached into the folds of his dark tunic and produced a plain linen handkerchief, wiping a stray tear from my cheek with a gentleness that completely contradicted the lethal fury I had just witnessed. "The grief is necessary, Eleanor," he said softly, the rough edge of his voice returning to its calming depth. "But you must not let it consume you. A queen cannot rule from her knees." I took a shuddering breath of the scent of cedar and cold iron settling my racing pulse. "I do not know how to be a queen, Thomas. I have spent my entire life learning how to be invisible." "And you mastered it because you had to survive," he countered, his pale gray eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made the air in the study feel thin. "But survival is no longer the objective. You have the intellect, the bearing, and the blood of a sovereign. The crown is already yours. Now you must simply decide if you have the will to bear its weight." He turned away for a moment, stepping toward the grand fireplace to stoke the dying embers. The firelight cast long, dancing shadows across his sharp features. "I have ruled this kingdom for 10 years, Thomas began, his back to me. His voice was lower now, lacking the commanding resonance he used in his court. It was intimate, vulnerable. "I have commanded armies, broken sieges, and forged treaties in blood, and I have done all of it entirely alone. I believed that absolute solitude was the necessary price of absolute power. I believed that caring for someone, allowing anyone to see the man behind the crown, would be a fatal vulnerability." He set the iron poker down. The metallic clink rang sharply in the quiet room. He turned back to face me, and the guarded, impenetrable monarch of the north was entirely gone. In his place stood a man looking at me with a reverence that stole the breath from my lungs. Then you arrived at my borders. He continued, taking a slow, deliberate step toward me. A banished princess in a ruined keep, armed with a single book and a ridiculous amount of pride. You challenged my scholars, you refused my charity, and you ruined every theory I ever held about what a ruler required to survive. The distance between us vanished. I tilted my head up, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I looked into the eyes of the most feared man on the continent. I am not merely offering you my armies to reclaim your throne, Eleanor, Thomas murmured, his hand lifting to brush a dark curl from my temple. The warmth of his skin against the winter chill was intoxicating. I am offering you my partnership, my kingdom, myself. I want the mornings in the archives. I want the debates by the fire. I want the only woman who has ever had the courage to look the Winter King in the eye and tell him he is wrong. The hollow space inside my chest, the void left by years of neglect and betrayal, suddenly flooded with blinding, terrifying light. I had been taught that love was a weakness used by the ambitious to manipulate the naive. But what Thomas offered was not manipulation. It was a foundation of solid stone. I want that, I whispered, my voice trembling not from fear, but from the overwhelming magnitude of the truth. I want all of it. He exhaled a long, ragged breath, as though he had been waiting for my answer since the moment he first saw me on the ridge. His hand moved to cup my jaw, his thumb tracing the line of my cheekbone. When he kissed me, there was no hesitation. It was a collision of fire and ice, a slow, deep, devastating kiss that tasted of northern wind and the absolute certainty of fate. My hands found the heavy wool of his tunic, gripping him as though he were the only solid thing left in the universe. In that suspended, perfect moment, the exiled princess died and the queen was born. But the world does not halt its rotation for the declarations of lovers. A sharp, urgent knock on the heavy oak doors shattered the silence. Thomas broke the kiss, resting his forehead against mine for a fleeting second before his posture shifted instantly back to that of a wartime commander. "Enter," he barked. The commander of the Winter Guard stepped in, bowing deeply. "Forgive the intrusion, Your Majesty. Our scouts on the southern border have just sent word. A royal carriage bearing the crest of the southern regent has crossed into our territory. Queen Regent Felicity and Princess Lucille are inside. They are riding hard for the palace and will arrive before dusk." Thomas's jaw clenched. The lethal light returned to his eyes. He looked down at me, and I felt my own spine straighten my shoulders, squaring instinctively. "She has come to drag you back before you discover the truth of your inheritance," Thomas said, his voice cold and precise, "or to ensure you never leave the North alive." I reached up and touched the silver cameo at my throat. The fear that had ruled my life for 24 years was gone, replaced by a cold, glittering resolve. "Let her come," I said, the words echoing with the authority of my mother's bloodline. "It is time she met the true queen." I wept until there was nothing left inside me but a vast echoing hollow. Through it all, the Winter King did not release me. He stood as immovable as the glacial mountains of his realm, offering a silent, unyielding fortress against the devastation that was tearing my world apart. When my tears finally ceased, leaving my chest heaving and my throat raw, I pulled back slowly. Thomas did not let me retreat far. His large hands moved to my shoulders, his grip firm and grounding. He reached into the folds of his dark tunic and produced a plain linen handkerchief, wiping a stray tear from my cheek with a gentleness that completely contradicted the lethal fury I had just witnessed. "The grief is necessary, Eleanor," he said softly, the rough edge of his voice returning to its calming depth. "But you must not let it consume you. A queen cannot rule from her knees." I took a shuddering breath of the scent of cedar and cold iron settling my racing pulse. "I do not know how to be a queen, Thomas. I have spent my entire life learning how to be invisible. And you mastered it because you had to survive." He countered, his pale gray eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made the air in the study feel thin. "But survival is no longer the objective. You have the intellect, the bearing, and the blood of a sovereign. The crown is already yours. Now you must simply decide if you have the will to bear its weight." He turned away for a moment, stepping toward the grand fireplace to stoke the dying embers. The firelight cast long, dancing shadows across his sharp features. "I have ruled this kingdom for 10 years. Thomas began, his back to me. His voice was lower now, lacking the commanding resonance he used in his court. It was intimate, vulnerable. I have commanded armies, broken sieges, and forged treaties in blood. And I have done all of it entirely alone. I believe that absolute solitude was the necessary price of absolute power. I believe that caring for someone, allowing anyone to see the man behind the crown, would be a fatal vulnerability. He set the iron poker down. The metallic clink rang sharply in the quiet room. He turned back to face me, and the guarded, impenetrable monarch of the North was entirely gone. In his place stood a man looking at me with a reverence that stole the breath from my lungs. "Then you arrived at my borders," he continued, taking a slow, deliberate step toward me. "A banished princess in a ruined keep, armed with a single book and a ridiculous amount of pride. You challenged my scholars, you refused my charity, and you ruined every theory I ever held about what a ruler required to survive." The distance between us vanished. I tilted my head up, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I looked into the eyes of the most feared man on the continent. "I am not merely offering you my armies to reclaim your throne, Eleanor," Thomas murmured, his hand lifting to brush a dark curl from my temple. The warmth of his skin against the winter chill was intoxicating. "I am offering you my partnership, my kingdom, myself. I want the mornings in the archives. I want the debates by the fire. I want the only woman who has ever had the courage to look the Winter King in the eye and tell him he is wrong." The hollow space inside my chest, the void left by years of neglect and betrayal, suddenly flooded with blinding, terrifying light. I had been taught that love was a weakness used by the ambitious to manipulate the naive. But what Thomas offered was not manipulation. It was a foundation of solid stone. "I want that," I whispered, my voice trembling not from fear, but from the overwhelming magnitude of the truth. "I want all of it." He exhaled a long, ragged breath, as though he had been waiting for my answer since the moment he first saw me on the ridge. His hand moved to cup my jaw, his thumb tracing the line of my cheekbone. When he kissed me, there was no hesitation. It was a collision of fire and ice, a slow, deep, devastating kiss that tasted of northern wind and the absolute certainty of fate. My hands found the heavy wool of his tunic, gripping him as though he were the only solid thing left in the universe. In that suspended perfect moment, the exiled princess died and the queen was born. But the world does not halt its rotation for the declarations of lovers. A sharp, urgent knock on the heavy oak doors shattered the silence. Thomas broke the kiss, resting his forehead against mine for a fleeting second before his posture shifted instantly back to that of a wartime commander. "Enter," he barked. The commander of the Winter Guard stepped in, bowing deeply. "Forgive the intrusion, Your Majesty. Our scouts on the southern border have just sent word. A royal carriage bearing the crest of the southern regent has crossed into our territory. Queen Regent Felicity and Princess Lucille are inside. They are riding hard for the palace and will arrive before dusk." Thomas's jaw clenched. The lethal light returned to his eyes. He looked down at me, and I felt my own spine straighten my shoulders, squaring instinctively. "She has come to drag you back before you discover the truth of your inheritance," Thomas said, his voice cold and precise, "or to ensure you never leave the North alive." I reached up and touched the silver cameo at my throat. The fear that had ruled my life for 24 years was gone, replaced by a cold, glittering resolve. "Let her come," I said, the words echoing with the authority of my mother's bloodline. "It is time she met the true queen." The great hall of the Winter Palace was a masterpiece of intimidation. 6 massive silver chandeliers blazing with hundreds of candles hung suspended from the vaulted ceiling. The floor was a flawless expanse of polished black obsidian, mirroring the cold majesty of the 2 silver thrones that sat elevated at the far end of the room. It was not a room designed for pleasantries. It was a room designed to make visitors acutely aware of their own insignificance. I stood in the shadows behind the towering marble pillars flanking the throne dais. I was no longer wearing the threadbare wool of an outcast. Mrs. Fenn, weeping with fierce pride, had dressed me in a gown of midnight velvet embroidered with silver threads that caught the candlelight like freshly fallen snow. Around my shoulders rested the heavy sapphire cloak Thomas had given me, and pinned securely at its clasp was my mother's silver cameo. The heavy iron-bound doors of the great hall groaned open, the sound echoing like a death knell across the silent expanse. Queen Regent Felicity entered, sweeping into the room with the practiced, aggressive elegance of a woman who believed the world existed solely to serve her. She wore a traveling gown of heavy crimson silk, her chin held high, her dark eyes scanning the room for threats. Beside her walked my half-sister Princess Lucille, wrapped in pale furs, looking exhausted and profoundly terrified by the sheer scale of the northern fortress. King Thomas sat upon the higher of the two silver thrones. He wore the formal raiment of his office, a heavy mantle of black wolf fur, and a crown of jagged blackened iron resting upon his brow. He did not rise to greet them. He did not speak. He simply watched them approach with the coiled stillness of a predator, waiting for its prey to step into the trap. The sharp rhythmic clicking of Felicity's heels on the obsidian floor was the only sound in the cavernous hall until she stopped 20 paces from the dais. She curtsied a shallow perfunctory dip that barely disguised her arrogance. "Your Majesty, King Thomas." Felicity began projecting her voice to fill the space. She wore a mask of polite maternal concern, a flawless performance I had witnessed 1,000 times. "I apologize for arriving unannounced. I have come to retrieve my wayward stepdaughter, Lady Eleanor. It seems the northern air has not been conducive to her fragile temperament, and her presence here is a burden we no longer wish to impose upon the winter crown." Thomas leaned forward slowly, resting his forearms on his knees. The silver rings on his fingers glinted in the candlelight. "You do not impose upon my crown, Queen Regent." Thomas replied, his voice a low rumble that carried effortlessly across the hall. "But you do insult my intelligence, which is a far more dangerous offense." Felicity's perfectly painted smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "I assure you, Your Majesty, I meant no offense. This is merely a private familial matter, a southern issue. If you would just surrender the girl to my guards, we shall depart your lands immediately." "She is not a girl to be surrendered," Thomas said, his tone dropping to a chilling register, "and she is certainly not yours to command. Princess Eleanor is a sovereign guest of the Winter Kingdom. More importantly, she is the rightful ruler of the lands you currently occupy." A heavy, suffocating silence slammed into the room. Lucille gasped, taking a step back, her pale eyes wide with shock. Felicity went absolutely still, the maternal mask shattering, instantly replaced by the cold, vicious face of a cornered usurper. "I do not know what lies that manipulative creature has whispered into your ear, King Thomas," Felicity hissed, her voice trembling with rising panic. "But I sent you a royal missive detailing her treason. She is a danger to my husband's throne. Your husband is a consort who occupies a stolen seat." Thomas's voice erupted a roar of pure authoritative thunder that made the chandeliers tremble. He stood up, towering over the dais, the embodiment of northern wrath. "I have seen the decrees, Felicity. I hold the documents of the Vanguard Trust. I know about the royal mandate left by Queen Catherine. You sent the true heir to freeze in the dark because you knew that in 4 months the entire Southern army would legally kneel to her and you would be cast out into the streets where you belong." Felicity stepped back, her face draining of color. That is Southern statecraft. It does not concern the North." "It concerns me," a new voice echoed through the hall. I stepped out from the shadows of the marble pillar. The heavy drag of my velvet gown swept against the obsidian floor as I walked slowly toward the center of the hall. I kept my spine perfectly straight, my shoulders back, channeling every ounce of the royal blood that flowed through my veins. Felicity stared at me as if I were a ghost risen from a grave she had personally dug. Her eyes darted over my immaculate gown, the heavy royal cloak, and finally settled on my face. She expected to see the cowering, silent girl she had abused for a decade. Instead, she saw a queen. "Eleanor," Felicity whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of her shock. "What is this?" I stopped 10 paces away from her, standing firmly beside the dais, Thomas stepping down to stand shoulder to shoulder with me. The visual of the two of us, the Winter King and the true Southern heir, was an insurmountable wall of power. "This is the end of your reign, Felicity," I said, my voice ringing out clear, cold, and utterly devoid of mercy. "You spent 6 years trying to erase my mother's legacy. You tore down her gardens, you burned her instruments, and you tried to convince me that I was nothing but a plain, worthless burden." I took 1 step closer. Felicity instinctively recoiled. "I believed your cruelty for a very long time," I continued, staring directly into the terrified eyes of the woman who had ruined my life. "Because when a child hears lies from the lips of the people meant to protect her, she mistakes it for the truth. But I am not plain. I am not a burden. And I am no longer terrified of you." "You have nothing," Felicity spat, panic making her vicious. "You are alone, a banished brat." "She is not alone." Thomas interrupted, his voice dropping to a lethal, quiet threat. He reached out and took my hand, intertwining his fingers with mine in front of her, a public, unbreakable alliance. She has the full military might of the Winter Kingdom at her back. And if you so much as raise your voice to her again, Queen Regent, I will have my guards lock you in Heir Keep and let the winter finish the job you started. Felicity looked from Thomas's imposing, deadly stare to my unwavering gaze. The reality of her total absolute defeat crashed over her. The trap had been sprung, the steel jaws locking firmly around the usurper's throat. The silence in the great hall of the Winter Palace was no longer the heavy, suffocating quiet of oppression. It was the ringing, crystalline silence of absolute victory. Felicity's chest heaved as her desperate gaze darted toward the heavy iron doors, then to the silent, imposing ranks of the Winter Guard lining the walls. Her own southern guards, a meager detail of 4 men standing near the entrance, had already lowered their halberds. Even they recognized that drawing steel in the throne room of the Winter King was an invitation to slaughter. They would not die for a usurper whose secret had just been laid bare. "You cannot do this," Felicity whispered, her voice stripped of its haughty resonance, reduced to a hollow, pathetic rasp. "I am the Queen Regent. I have the loyalty of the High Lords." "You have the loyalty of men whose pockets you lined with my mother's gold," I corrected her, my voice echoing off the obsidian floors with a terrifying calm. "But that gold runs dry the moment I come of age, and I assure you, Felicity, the High Lords of the South are loyal only to power. When they learn that the Vanguard Trust has been activated and that the military might of the Winter Kingdom stands behind my claim, your sycophants will abandon you before the ink on my royal decree is even dry." I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the freezing ancient air of the north fill my lungs. The frightened girl who had cowered in the shadows of the southern corridors was dead. I was the heir to the throne, and it was time I wielded its power. "You exiled me to the most desolate corner of the realm, hoping I would simply vanish into the snow," I said, my words falling like strikes of a hammer. "But the North did not break me. It forged me. By the authority of the Vanguard Decree and the royal blood of Queen Catherine, I strip you of your title as Queen Regent. You will be escorted back to the south under the guard of King Thomas's men. You will pack your personal belongings, and you will be exiled to the eastern coastal monastery. You will never set foot in the capital, nor wear the royal colors again." Felicity's knees finally gave way. The rustle of her heavy crimson silk was loud in the quiet hall as she collapsed onto the polished obsidian floor. The woman who had spent 6 years trying to erase my existence was now a crumpled, defeated shadow at my feet. "Take her," Thomas commanded. His voice was a low rumble of thunder. 4 elite guards in silver and black armor stepped forward, hauling the sobbing usurper to her feet and marching her toward the heavy doors. She did not look back. Left behind was Princess Lucille. My half-sister stood trembling, her pale fur cloak wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She looked at me not with hatred, but with a profound, shattering realization of the cruelty she had unknowingly benefited from all her life. She took a hesitant step forward and dropped into a deep, flawless curtsy. "Eleanor," Lucille's voice shook, tears spilling over her pale lashes. "I swear to you on my life, I did not know about the trust. I did not know what she was planning. I only knew that I was a coward for never speaking up when she was cruel to you." I looked at her. I could have banished her as well. I could have let the bitterness of the past dictate her future. But a true queen does not rule through blind vengeance. She rules through justice. "I know you did not know, Lucille," I said softly, the harshness leaving my tone. I stepped forward and extended my hand, lifting her from the cold floor. "You were a pawn in her game as much as I was the discarded piece. You will return to the capital. You will retain your title as princess, and you will help me rebuild the court she poisoned. We begin anew." Lucille wept, pressing her forehead against my hand in a gesture of absolute, genuine fealty. The cycle of cruelty had been broken. 4 months later, the southern capital witnessed a spectacle it had not seen in a century. On the morning of my 25th birthday, I did not stand in the shadows of the throne room. I walked down the center aisle of the grand cathedral, the heavy train of my golden velvet gown sweeping over the ancient marble. The high lords of the South, the very men who had ignored me for years, bowed so deeply their foreheads nearly brushed the floor. My father, stripped of his unearned authority, but allowed to live out his days in quiet retirement, watched from the balconies as the High Bishop placed the Vanguard crown, a breathtaking circlet of diamonds and white gold, upon my head. "I present to you Eleanor, true Queen of the South, The bishop's voice boomed, echoing through the vaulted ceilings. The roar of the crowd was deafening, a wave of sound that shook the stained glass windows. But my eyes were not on the cheering lords or the banners bearing my mother's restored crest. My gaze was locked on the man standing at the base of the dais. King Thomas of the Winter Kingdom stood clad in his immaculate dark armor, the silver dire wolf crest gleaming on his chest. He did not bow, for a king bows to no one, but he placed his right fist over his heart and inclined his head to me. The guarded lethal monarch of the North looked at me with a pride so fierce it eclipsed the sun. We were married a month later in a ceremony that united the continent. It was not a marriage of political convenience nor a forced alliance. It was the union of two sovereigns who had found their equals in the darkest of times. The wedding took place on the high ridge overlooking Heir Keep, the exact spot where the Winter King had first laid eyes upon the banished princess. The northern winds whipped around us wild and free as we spoke our vows beneath a sky the color of crushed sapphires. I kept the ruined stone keep exactly as it was. I did not rebuild it. And in the grand archives of the Winter Palace, resting inside a velvet-lined glass case on Thomas's massive ironwood desk, sits a single silver cameo brooch alongside a framed parchment note that reads, "The northern winds have no mercy for those who refuse to arm themselves against it." Sometimes, when the palace is asleep and the fire burns down to glowing embers, I stand on the grand balcony of the Winter Palace, wrapped in the heavy blue cloak my husband gave me. I look out over the vast, glittering expanse of the snow-covered kingdom, and I feel the terrifying, magnificent weight of my crown. They sent me to the freezing north to disappear. They did not know the cold would preserve my bloodline, and they certainly did not know that when you cast a true queen into the dark, she simply learns how to conquer the shadows.